In topic 9.8, we're going to talk a little bit about invasive species. And the definition of an invasive species is a species that can live and actually thrive in an area outside of its native range. And invasive species are often can present a major problem for native species when they take hold. Often these invasive non-native species are generalists. They often reproduce quickly, and because they've not evolved in their new location, oftentimes they have no predators and they can outcompete native species and displace them or cause them to become endangered or even extinct. Sometimes these invasive species are purposely transported into a new ecosystem. Other times it's unintentional, but the end result is the same, that these species pose a problem for native species. In this slide, what you see are two examples of invasive species. This is a cane toad. Cane toads are native to Central America, and they were often introduced into ecosystems as a way of controlling insect pests of sugarcane. That's why it's called a cane toad. And this was done in Puerto Rico and Hawaii and many other places that grow sugarcane. In 1935, cane toads were introduced into Australia, and since then they have expanded across the entire continent. They have grown to populations of millions and millions, or maybe even billions of these animals. They have caused the extinction of native reptile species. They've caused problems for domesticated animals and pets, and they have wreaked havoc on native species in Australia. So this is an example of invasive species introduced purposely from one part of the world to another, causing serious negative consequences. On the right side of this slide, we have a plant called kudzu. Kudzu is native to Japan. It was introduced in the United States as a way of reducing soil erosion during the Dust Bowl area. Planting this very fast-growing vine helped to anchor the soil. But it also has since spread throughout many parts of the U.S., especially the southeast U.S., where it grows extremely rapidly. This shows a season's growth over an old abandoned cabin, you can see. And kudzu causes, again, the smothering of native plants, the reduction of sunlight into the lower parts of the canopy, and generally becomes a threat to native plant species and native ecosystems. So when species are introduced to a new area, at first there's a short window of time in which they can be eradicated. So if we look at this graph, this shows means of control of invasive species. Obviously, the most important one is prevention, not taking and transferring species from one area to another. And one example of this, if you ever go camping in New York State, you might know you're not supposed to bring firewood from one part of the state to another part of the state. And the reason is because often that firewood might be infested with invasive insects, and if you take it from one part of the state to another part of the state, then you could be transferring that pest and causing the problem to become exacerbated. So preventing these species from spreading is obviously the best way of limiting the impact of invasive species. When species do start to become a population starts to take hold in an area, if the population is relatively limited, the first way of dealing with it is through eradication, actually destroying the population before it can start to spread and expand. Oftentimes, however, these species are not eradicated during those early stages, and they do spread geographically very widely. Their populations grow, and at that point, there's no way of eradicating the species. So often, the next step is containment, trying to reduce the spread of these organisms as much as possible and minimizing the long-term effects on native species. And then finally, once these species become extremely widespread and abundant, it's just managing and trying to limit the impacts on native populations. in order to control invasive species, we have a variety of ways of doing that. One way is through mechanically, actually, like if we're talking about a plant, destroying it, pulling it out, uprooting it, burning large patches of invasive plants, killing invasive fish species, fishing for them, using chemicals to destroy zebra mussels, for example. That would be a chemical way, a pesticide, to destroy those invasives. If another way of doing this is through what we call biocontrol, using one species to control an invasive species. Using its own natural enemies to combat it is one way of trying to deal with these invasive species. I used to do a project in which we would raise these beetles, the Coleoptera beetle, in the classroom, and then we would go to the Utica Marsh and release these beetles, and they were also came from Asia, and they were meant to control purple loosestrife, an invasive plant species. So we were trying to use one species to control another species. There's lots of examples. We could go on and on for hours talking about different types of invasive species and what their impacts are, etc. But we'll just talk real quickly about a couple examples. This is probably one of the ones you're most familiar with. These are zebra mussels, these small mussels. They are here growing attached to a native mussel. So mussels are bivalves, mollusks. There are freshwater mussels that are native to our streams and lakes and throughout New York State. Zebra mussels were introduced, they're first found in 1988 in Canada and the Great Lakes, and they since have spread along the St. Lawrence Seaway, through streams and rivers and so forth throughout many parts of the Northeast. And they present major problems. They outcompete native mussels. They grow and reproduce very quickly. They clog intake pipes that are bringing water in. They can cut up your feet. They can damage equipment. They can filter out so many phytoplankton from the water that they disrupt the food web. They have a host of negative impacts. So here's some other plant species, and here are some other animals. A Chinese mitten crab. This is a lamprey, the sea lamprey. Water fleas, snakehead fish. Snakeheads are found in 2002. They've made their way throughout many parts of the eastern United States, and they can actually breathe air. They can migrate over wet land a quarter of a mile. They can survive 4 days out of the water, and they've spread from one place to another because of some of these generalist adaptations they have that allows them to be successful. And when they do spread and reach a lake, they become the apex predator, and that disrupts food webs and threatens native predators. Lots of plants can also be invasive species. Giant hogweed, for example, is what's shown here. It's a toxic plant. This is purple loosestrife, this wetland marsh dwelling plant that was introduced in the United States from Asia as an ornamental landscaping plant, but has escaped and now is dominating wetlands throughout many parts of the Northeast. It outcompetes native cattails, which are the native wetland plant, and those cattails serve as food, as a breeding space for lots of different birds and other animals. And so when this purple loosestrife takes over, it can displace that breeding habitat and living habitat of those species. There are many types of invasive species that have damaged different types of trees. Hemlocks, ash trees are impacted by this emerald ash borer, which bores into the wood and eventually kills the tree. Longhorn beetles, wood wasp, spotted lanternflies, wild boar. These are all examples of species that have taken hold in the United States and have presented major problems ecologically in these areas.